Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. So I'm going to start off with a quick story. Hopefully you'll indulge me. So back in the 70s and 80s, one of the biggest and greatest rock bands on the planet was a band by the name of Van Halen. I'm going to hope a lot of you are familiar with them. I know this is a bit of a younger crowd, so maybe not. But that's a picture of them, and if that picture doesn't scream 80s, I don't know what does. The lead singer of that band was a guy by the name of David Lee Roth, who was the ultimate rock star. He was a bit of a diva, he was a showman, he was flashy, but he was unbelievably talented. And Van Halen was famous for a bunch of things. One of the things they were famous for was their live shows. They just had these massive touring shows that blew the crowd away. The other thing that they were really famous for was their rider. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, a rider is essentially a list of demands that a band or a performing artist gives to the venue when they show up to have in the green room, in the backstage area, whatever. And Van Halen had this bizarre demand on their rider, and it basically said that there had to be a bowl of M&Ms backstage at every one of their shows, but there could not be any brown M&Ms. Very weird, right? And they got a reputation as, again, a bunch of divas, rock stars. You know, M&Ms all taste the same, despite what you may see on these TikTok videos. I can assure you every M&M tastes exactly the same, regardless of the color. So years and years later, people finally started asking David Lee Roth, where did this come from and why did he put this in their rider? And the story behind it is fascinating. It's one of my favorite rock and roll stories of all time. So basically, like I said, Van Halen had a huge touring stage show. They were one of the first mainstream bands to do huge pyrotechnics, massive speaker sets, amps everywhere, just an insane, very technical setup for the stage. And what the band found was that oftentimes they would show up at a venue and no one bothered to read the instructions on how to put this stage set together. And what that meant for them was that they were literally putting their lives at risk because the stage could collapse, some pyro could go wrong, something could go absolutely haywire on them. So David Lee Roth had a brilliant idea. What he did was he put together this 40-page contract, and it's funny, you can find it online, and buried in the middle of these technical instructions on how to set up the stage was this one demand that said that there needs to be a bowl of M&Ms backstage, but no brown M&Ms. And this meant that the morning of a show or the day of a show, they could show up, and as soon as they saw a bowl of M&Ms with brown M&Ms in it, they knew damn well that they didn't bother to read the contract, didn't pay attention to detail, and that they weren't going to go on that night until they redid the entire stage setup. So a really simple way to solve a complex problem just by burying it inside in their contract, in the middle of their contract. So why am I telling this story when I'm here to talk about automation and data and managed services? Well, if you fast forward to 2024, this would roughly be the equivalent of the stage tech at Madison Square Garden asking ChatGPT how to set up Van Halen's stage. It just can't be done because ChatGPT does not have their data. And that's what I'm here to talk about, the value of the data that you all have in your organizations today, why it's important, how to leverage it, and what it means for you going forward. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of large language models. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But if you haven't read the story or listened to the podcast from the New York Times about a month or two ago now called AI's Original Sin, I highly recommend it. It talks about how all these companies, OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, how they train these large language models. And what they did was they essentially ripped all of the content from the internet and used it to train the models. So as we sit here today, about 99% of all publicly available content, and that includes things like YouTube, podcasts, things that they shouldn't have ripped that's not really public. About 99% of that content exists inside these large language models that we interact with on a daily basis, but only about 1% of enterprise data lives inside of these large language models. And that is the opportunity that I think we're faced with to, again, optimize our service delivery, improve automations, and just improve the overall quality of data, because that's the data that drives your business forward. I'll give you some quick numbers to explain why that's important. In the meantime, I'll just move on to this slide. So if you're a typical MSP, I'm not going to say the publication, but one of the rankings of MSPs around the world came out recently, or at least started to come out recently. And I believe the approximate numbers were that the average MSP on the list had about 33 employees. Well, our studies and our data show that the average per employee at an MSP is about 150 end users. So if you do the math really quickly, a 33-person MSP times 150 end users, that's 4,950 end users they support. I'm going to make the math easy. I'm going to say it's 5,000. Again, studies show, and you can get this from other industry sources, don't take my word for it, the average end user at an MSP puts in 0.6 tickets a month. So if you do the math real quickly, that's about 3,000 tickets a month for your average MSP. So I'm going to assume you're all somewhere average, right? Some larger, some smaller. It's not really important. The key is that every one of those tickets is an opportunity to improve your service, your delivery, your automation, because they all offer hints and advice and suggestions to what you need to do. So what do I mean by that? So let's say you put your tickets in and you hire someone as a dispatcher to manually classify them. Well, chances are they're not doing a particularly good job. If they are, you're paying them a lot of money and that's all they're doing. Let's say you're hiring someone to budget them and put time estimates against how long it should take. Again, probably a very expensive resource, probably not doing it accurately because they've never spent time on the field. Why not leverage the data that you already have in your organization, those hundreds of thousands of tickets, configurations, documents, runbooks, user guides, manuals, leverage all of that to optimize that data inside your organization, in your PSAs, in your ITSMs, in whatever platforms, to drive those automations. And we know automations kick off things like RPAs, they kick off workflows, they kick off routing and triage. And if they're not accurate up front, you can't do a good job with it. And the only way to truly make them accurate is to use your data to evaluate them, to classify them, and to prioritize them. Let's say you were at the bar with me last night and I gave you a bottle of Tito's, or I showed you a bottle of Tito's, unopened bottle of Tito's vodka. And I said to you, here's this bottle of vodka, but here's this obfuscated jug that's got some liquid in it that I'm going to mix it with. So I want you to take this known liquid and throw it in with this unknown liquid, and then I want you to drink it. Chances are you don't know me. I'm not very trustworthy looking. You probably wouldn't drink that, right? I don't blame you. I wouldn't drink it either. That's what happens when you take your data and throw it into one of those large language models, right? I don't care how much of your own data you're putting against OpenAI. And listen, no offense to OpenAI. I had a great company, really cool technology for consumer-based uses. But when you throw your data against OpenAI, you're mixing it with something that you absolutely don't know what's in there, and you can't predict what's going to come out the other side. Same way, like I said, I wouldn't recommend drinking something that you don't know all of the ingredients of, right? You need full clarity, full transparency, and full governance. So just real quickly to touch on a few of these slides here, we like to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we face every day. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the top one, the core challenges. You all know what they are. But again, like I mentioned, you often have inaccurate data in your tickets, which drives poor automation or doesn't let you optimize it. That data is stored in distinct, disparate systems, often siloed from each other. So if you're leveraging your PSA for this data, but let's say you have something in your RMM or in your CMDB, right, you get no value out of that. And all of this leads to a tremendous amount of manual work that is just inefficient and ineffective. So the way we counter that at Crushbank is by building what we call data lakes, custom data lakes for our clients. So essentially what that means is we take all of your data and we put it into one large data repository called a data lake inside of a vector database with embeddings and all that fun stuff. And by doing that, we make all the data available across your organization from one place, one single source of truth. And that gives you the opportunity to do a bunch of things. You can then start to use that data to really drive your automations. Again, so let's say, for example, we'll just talk about ticket classification. If you get a ticket in from a client and you just take the contents of that ticket and send it to OpenAI or ChatGPT and say, classify this ticket, it might be right 60% of the time. It probably won't be, but it might be right 60% of the time. But what if that model that you send it to was custom trained on your entire ticketing history? Well, that model is going to be right 95% of the time. Maybe even more, give or take. Maybe a little bit less, it depends on the tickets you have. Same thing with things like budget. Same things with summarizations. If these models are not trained and don't understand your data, all they're doing is relying on the 2 trillion parameters of public data that they've ingested that, again, don't necessarily relate to how you do business, how your customers do business, things like that. So by putting all the data into a data lake, again, you have a single source of truth for everything from customization, you have consistency across, you have access to the data, it can drive a lot of outcomes, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. The other piece, though, is it's not just about the data, right? So throwing a bunch of data into a large data lake is good, it's interesting, it's valuable for things like search and for building and training these models, but really, you need a more holistic approach to this. You need to understand the metadata associated with it. In that little yellow box, we have an example here. Let's say you're a SonicWall shop and you have 100 customers that run SonicWall. Well, if you just go to the data lake and say, hey, what's the IP address of the SonicWall, it's probably going to give you the wrong answer, right? It's 1% chance, 1 out of 100. Whereas if you have the metadata, so you understand who the client is, what the location is, when it was installed, all the pieces of data that make it unique, it gets that much more valuable. So just uploading a file to some data repository somewhere, I don't care what it is you use, whether you throw it into something like Dropbox or throw it into an Azure DB or throw it into Snowflake, I don't care. That's not what's relevant. What's relevant is that if you don't have the data properly tagged, you don't know how to take advantage of it, you're not able to leverage it for what you need to do, for what you need to deliver. So as equally important as the metadata, as the data itself, the content of the data, is the metadata associated with it. So really quickly, just take a look at one example here from Crushbank. These are what we call our smart ticket automation. So typically, your average ticket before Crushbank would have your company, your contact, and some sort of a ticket description. What we do is when that ticket is created, we run it through our automation process. So we'll put, again, type, subtype, and item on it. We'll put a budget on it. We'll create a summary for you so your text can start working on it right away, as opposed to having to spend time reading and deciphering a bunch of back and forth emails. We'll create a summary of the resolution when it's completed. Right now, the way this works, again, you need to be a Crushbank client. It is standalone. We ingest all your data. We could talk a little bit about that. We have a booth at the pavilion. But coming really soon, we're going to have a crate right inside Roost so you can do that. So being a Roost client, you'll be able to leverage our technology. Now, the advantage for you there is twofold. First, yes, you can do a lot of this with Roost today using OpenAI, and that's fine, and it works fairly well for the most part. But by switching over to using a crate from Crushbank, you'll be able to do a couple of things. First, again, you'll be able to use a custom-trained model, purpose-built for your business, for your organization, so trained on all your data. So that means as you make changes, as you evolve, if you need to go back historically, if you do an acquisition, all of that can be run through that Crushbank model that was built for you. The second piece is it'll save you conservatively 20 to 25% on the OpenAI costs. And the reason for that is that if you're using a large language model from OpenAI, again, it's multi-trillion parameters. It's very expensive. That means you can't really tune it without a lot of cost, a lot of work. But also the inferences for that, and an inference essentially is anything that a large language model generates. The inferences for that are very expensive because they're very complex, very sophisticated models. We use open, transparent, small foundation models. That lets us do a couple of things. First, it lets us deliver it much more cost efficiently. Because again, the models we use, the technology we use, much cheaper, much easier to work with, much easier to customize, much easier to tune. The other piece is that it lets you customize it. So if I throw 1,000 examples for, say, against one of my 16 billion parameter models, I assure you it moves the needle much more than it would throwing it against a 2 trillion parameter model from OpenAI. So basically that's, in a nutshell, some of the automation value that Crushbank offers. We have more than that as well, though. We do have what we call conversational search. We also have cognitive search. I'll talk about that in a minute. But really quickly, I just think it's important to explain how we do it. I talked a little bit about this. Again, custom built for your business, so as your business grows and changes, as your needs change, the AI can adapt to it, the language models. It is specific. It is all grounded in truth. That is the key. So things like drift, things like hallucination, things like bias, don't leak into your model because it is all grounded on something factual. So in other words, we have trained the model that saying, I don't know, is a perfectly acceptable answer. That is not the case when you're using like a ChatGPT or a Gemini from Google. It is not meant to be accurate. It is meant to generate an answer. So oftentimes, estimates say as high as 25% of the times, that answer is a hallucination. That can't happen when your data is grounded and requires factual information. We also underlie the entire thing with governance. So this is a concept that's not being talked about nearly enough in the AI and data space. We're an IBM partner. We use watsonx. Watson has a platform called watsonx.governance. And basically what that does is it real-time monitors the outputs of these language models for those things I talked about. So it's monitoring to make sure it's not hallucinating, monitoring for bias, it's monitoring for drift. So all of that is happening in real time and adjusting the model dynamically on the fly. So if you're using it and inputs leak in, or data changes, or some sort of outside effect starts to impact it, it will adjust dynamically and we'll start getting more accurate data. And again, just the availability of all the data being in one data lake. So now your tech doesn't have to worry about, does this live in IT Glue? Does it live in ConnectWise? Does it live in, I don't know, Ninja RMM? Wherever it lives, we can pull all that data in, make it available in real time. So we had a client that we were working with for this classification of, again, type, subtype, and item. And this is an anonymized spreadsheet. There's no important data on here. But basically, what happened was they told us, we went to them and said 53% of your tickets, the type is set to must change. I'm sure nobody in here has that problem, but pretend you're one of those companies that does, or that you know someone that does. So we said, look, more than half your tickets aren't being classified. So you can't do anything with them, right? You can't route them, you can't triage them, you can't workflow them, whatever. You can't kick off RPAs. All the things you want to do to drive automation in your business, dead on arrival if the tickets aren't classified. So they said, all right, no problem. That's a great input. What we're going to do as the client is we're going to put together a concerted effort. We're going to put someone whose job it is to classify these. We're going to dedicate them to it. We're going to make them guarantee that every ticket that comes in gets properly classified. That number dropped from 53% down to 44%. So sure, it did something, but it was not impactful. So we said, great, let us pull a bunch of examples. Let us run it through our classifier simulator, which is what this is, and let's show you what it will come out with. So you'll notice two things that happen, and I know the spreadsheet is probably a little bit hard to see. But first piece is that on the left-hand side, you can see all the ones that were listed as virtual desktop. Only about 6 or so of those were actually virtual desktop. The rest of them changed. The other ones that weren't classified at all got classified. So in other words, we're not only classifying things that weren't classified, we're properly classifying them. The other thing we do that I find interesting, I came from managed services. I owned an MSP for 30 years before starting Crushbank, is that we classify tickets on close. And I'll tell you the story behind this because you'll find it kind of interesting. So we had a client that was a large healthcare company, and they were bought by a private equity firm. And if any of you have any clients in private equity or dealt with private equity, you know the first thing they look to do when they buy a company or they come in is to cut costs. So what they did was they came in and they said, hey, we're paying you whatever it is a month. Give me a report of all the tickets that we have generated in the last 6 months. So I gave them a report that looked a lot like this. It had the number, it had the person that submitted the ticket, it had the subject, and it had a type, subtype. And like 75 or 80% of those tickets were Citrix. I should have mentioned that they had about 2,500 users. They were a huge Citrix shop, 150 locations. Because what happened was anytime a user couldn't do something, couldn't log into the system, couldn't get access, couldn't do anything, they would call up and say Citrix is down. So my dispatcher put that in as a Citrix issue, right? She didn't know any better, or he didn't know any better. It made perfect sense. And no one bothered to look at the fact that it was really locked out because they couldn't log in because their account was locked out, or they didn't have internet access, or something else was down. So that 75% Citrix tickets was like 5%. So I ended up having to have a battle with this client to say, you don't have a bad Citrix implementation, we have bad processes. That didn't make me look any better, by the way, but at least I didn't have to rip out a 150 location Citrix environment and rebuild it from scratch. So we reclassify tickets on close. So in other words, when the ticket comes in, we'll read the body of the ticket, we'll classify it, and then when it's closed, we'll read through the notes and we'll see what the actual cause and effect were, and we'll reclassify it. So again, just tremendous, much higher quality of the data, much higher accuracy, much better information and reporting. So I mentioned that we're working closely with Halo. We should have a crate live, hopefully sometime next month, where you can start to use all this. In that case, it won't necessarily matter what systems you're using, but just to give you a really quick idea and overview of what systems that we do integrate with. All the ITSMs on the left side of your screen, all the typical ones you would understand. We embed right inside of those, again, for automations and for search and document retrieval. And then the right-hand side, sort of the data sources for configurations, documents, all the other things that run your business. Also, it's sort of small at the bottom, but we have a universal API that lets you put data in from any system. We have a client that runs an old AS400 that's got all their documentation on it, which is crazy, but again, it hasn't rebooted since 1967, so I don't blame them for not wanting to take it down. But nobody can get into it, right? Like, you don't need green screens anymore to access an AS400, but it's not far from it. So we worked with them to get all that documentation ingested into Crushbank. So again, as an IBM shop, it's kind of a fun success story that we took all this data out of an AS400, threw it against our APIs, and now it's living in IBM Watson X. So they love the story. But the point of that is it doesn't matter where the data is in your system, or in your organization rather, what platform where it's locked up. We have APIs to get the access in. We normalize the data. We enrich the data. So when we ingest it, we do things like concepts and categories and entities. That's, again, the data that drives your organization forward, right? So understanding that this is not just a Windows server. This is Windows 2016 R2, so that when you need to go and do reporting on end of life of servers coming up, if it's not properly documented or if it lives across multiple systems, all those data points, they're critical to the value of your data, salvaging them when they're ingested. So that's just sort of a quick overview of our integrations. Last thing I want to touch on real quickly is something we just recently released. Again, we're showing it over at our booth if you haven't stopped by to check it out. We call it Crushbank Neuro. It is conversational search. So it is, I started trashing them, but I'll bring it full circle. It's sort of like ChatGPT for your data and your organization. So we can embed that a bunch of different ways for you. Right now, you can do it right inside of a web browser. The screenshot here, as you can see, it's running inside of Teams. We run inside Slack. We can do it through SMS, even through IVR if you want to do it over a phone system. And basically what this is same thing. We ingest all of your data, and your tech can start asking questions about it. So right now, those questions are things like you see on the screen, what's the IP address of this wireless access point? And rather than finding the config that has that in there or the documentation that has that in there and then having to dig through it, we'll come back and say the IP address is whatever, with links to the documents where it came from if you need to find it. So really, really fast way to find data in your organization no matter where it lives. Again, one of our driving mottos is that we meet you where you work. Teams is a super popular platform, obviously, Slack as well. So we let the text live right inside the systems. Again, we embed inside the ITSMs as well. So you can do that. So really cool conversational search. Coming in about a month or two later this summer will be the next iteration of that, where you can start to ask synthesized questions about your data, aggregate questions. So in my Windows 2016 example, you could just have your account manager log into Teams and say, how many clients are still running Windows 2016 R2? And it would spit out a list of the clients for you. So a really easy way to find that data and interact with that data wherever it lives in your organization. The other thing we're enabling, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I know I'm just about out, is that we're going to let you sell this through to your customers. So every organization has data that's locked up, siloed inside their company somewhere. We're going to make this platform available as a service, essentially, for you to work with your clients and start to monetize AI and data for your clients. The single most important thing to start on your AI journey is the data, as I think I've tried to make clear. So if you start working with your clients today to start understanding where their data is, how it's categorized, where it lives, you can then start to leverage a system like this to give them solutions, whether, again, it's their own chat-based, whether it's their own conversational-based search, or whether it's their own aggregate answers, things like that. So again, come by the booth and talk to us about that. That's coming soon. I think this is my last slide. So really quickly, just to sort of summarize what I've said, automation needs a very strong foundation of data. It's critical, it's essential. Metadata is a key part of that, something that is often overlooked. And using private data lakes can allow you to start minimizing the risks associated with AI. Don't be the brown M&Ms in your organization. I know I have 3 or 4 minutes left. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Before we get to questions, first of all, it's great to see you again.
Thank you, Joe. You too.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for the briefings over the years. I always have questions. Anyone have questions? Okay, we have a hand in the middle. We'll jump there, and we do have 2 or 3 minutes, so let's hop right in. Your first name and just a little bit about your company, and then your question for David, please.
Yes, Dave, I'm from Boston. Do you ingest images and PDFs?
Images, yes. I didn't hear what the other one was.
PDFs?
Yeah, PDFs. So it doesn't matter what binary document format is. We'll ingest it. For images, we'll do OCR on it. PDFs, we'll convert it to text. So essentially, the data will be stored as raw text, but we'll keep the original document so that you can get the answer out of the document, but also if you need to see the original, we'll have that in a full fidelity version of that as well, yes.
Okay, we have a question over here. We're going to wait for a microphone. I'll ask you a fast one.
Yeah.
Early days of SIM, storage costs ran away.
Yeah.
Public cloud, AI, storage costs can run away. Consumption costs can run away. How do you avoid that potentially?
So the storage costs, sure. You know, we're pretty diligent about how we track. We're not going to keep 8,000 versions of documents. That's one of the challenges, right? These documents change constantly, so we'll keep 1 or 2 versions of it. So we'll try to keep that. The other piece is, as I mentioned, we're converting these into like the dumbest format, meaning like just raw text. So that really lets you control the storage costs. The area where costs become a challenge, and if you're not seeing this in your organization, you will, is the inference costs I talked about. So if you set up just a corporate ChatGPT account and let people start using it, I can assure you those costs will start to grow out of control very, very quickly. And it's even more challenging because nowadays everyone thinks you just shove all this data into what we call the context window. So in other words, when you're creating a prompt in one of these large language models, if you give it a bunch more data up front, it can generate a better answer for you. But the more data you put in, the more expensive that inference is, and the more you request out, the more it is. So that's the area you really need to keep a handle on. I think, again, working with a partner helps you control that, but I would monitor that stuff closely in your organization. I call it like what they used to call dark, like when users would basically run their own SaaS
Shadow
application.
IT.
Shadow IT.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. I call it Shadow GPT, right? Like users are going to start running up your costs by using these large language models.
Yep. Question over here.
How do you integrate or ingest data from closed platforms such as Continuum Command?
So everything we do is over API. If for some reason that the platform does not have an API, you need a way to get it out somehow, right? So we can go right to the database if there's database access. We can just take large uploads of files or zip files or things like that. So yeah, we do need to get the data out of the system. Our preference is to do it over API, but that's not always realistic. So we work with you to do that on a case-by-case basis.
Got it. So exporting CSVs to
That'll
say
work.
a SharePoint
Yep.
site. And then
That's what we need to do with IT Glue, quite frankly. IT Glue has a crappy API. Sorry, Kaseya, but they just
Thank
do.
you.
Excellent. Well, David, thank you very much for your time. And you're going to be off stage at the booth later?
Yes, I will. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Come by and see us.
And please thank your team for me. It was so generous with their time. I appreciate it. Great to see you.
Thanks, Joe.
Happy to hand for David.